I'm Carl Mueller with Liberty Mutual Group, and again, we're a sponsor of this event, and we're thrilled to do so. It's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Joel Hyatt, right here. Joel's a graduate of Dartmouth College and Yale Law School, and in 1977, he and Susan Hyatt co-founded Hyatt Legal Services, which helped revolutionize the distribution of legal services by making legal care affordable and accessible to middle and lower income families. Most recently, Joel and Al Gore founded Current TV, an Emmy Award-winning media company that blends user-generated and professionally produced content, citizen journalism, and viewer participation. Joel has twice been included in the list of 100 most powerful lawyers in the U.S. by the National Law Journal, and in 1994, he was the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate in Ohio. He's been a lecturer at the Stanford University's Graduate School of Business and School of Law, and he serves on a number of boards, including Hewlett-Packard, Morehouse College, and the Brookings Institution. Please welcome Joel Hyatt.
Thank you very much, Carl, and for sponsoring this panel. I want to thank Liberty Mutual. I also want to thank my sister, Debbie, who invited me to be the moderator today. As you can see, Debbie got the brains in the family. She also got the looks, which hardly seems like justice to me. And today we're going to be talking about justice. We have three outstanding panelists to do that with us today. Dambisa Moyo, Marta Sen, and Michael Sandell. And they're going to be talking today about the areas of work they concentrate in, which is not about creating elegant conceptions and theories of justice, but rather about applying principles of justice to real problems in the real world. A very different approach to the idea of justice. They seek to identify and alleviate injustice day to day throughout the world. We're going to start with Dambisa Moyo, who was born and raised in Zambia. She was educated at Oxford, where she got her doctorate. She worked at the World Bank and at Goldman Sachs. She broke on to the scene internationally with a very provocative book called Dead Aid: Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa, in which she argues that the foreign aid that has gone for so many years to Africa has done more harm than it has done good. Her second book will be coming out in January, and it's entitled How the West Was Lost: 50 Years of Economic Folly and the Stark Choices That Lie Ahead. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dambisa Moyo.
Okay, great. Hello, and thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of my thinking around justice, I guess as a broad term, but more specifically, talk to you a little bit about my thinking where the issues of development, particularly around the African continent, are concerned. Joel actually forgot to mention that I actually was a student here in Boston a number of years ago, about a decade ago. I was at the Kennedy School of Government, so it's wonderful to be back in Boston. I love the square, so it's great, and it's not cold for a change, because I was here, I was freezing all the time. In any case, I wanted to start off by throwing out to everyone that we're on the same side where Africa is concerned. I think I need to start here because I know there's a lot of polarization when it comes to the discussions around Africa and what we should be doing around Africa. But let's just always remember that we're all on the same side. We all want to see Africa become an equal partner on the global stage, and that includes Africans in particular. What I thought I would do today is just start by throwing out a few statistics. I'm unfortunately, for my sins, an economist, so we love figures, and I thought just in terms of setting the context before I make my arguments, I thought I'd throw out a number of figures for you. First of all, the African continent has about 1 billion people. That's 1 billion, 1/6 of the world population today. 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. 70% of Africans live on less than $2 a day. And I should throw out to you that actually in the 1970s, 10% of Africans lived on less than $1 a day. So actually things have gotten worse. It's important for us to realize that when you read the headlines, especially now, people are talking a lot about a positive story that's emerging and that African economies are growing at around 5.5%, which is actually a good statistic if you think about what's happening around the world economy. However, the United Nations has said that in order for Africa to meaningfully put a dent in poverty, it's going to need to grow at 7% on a sustained basis. That is clearly not where we are today. Another statistic for you is that the whole African continent, which is, as I said, 1 billion people, accounts for 2% of global trade, which is equal to the same amount of trade that Spain, a single country, accounts for. And finally, every day, 1 billion people around the world go hungry, the largest proportion of which, 400 million people, are in Africa. However, Africa is also the place that has the largest proportion of untilled arable land left on the continent. So here we have a situation. We've got a young population, a starving population, and yet they're sitting on a proportion of land that many people around the world would desperately be happy to work with. The question then becomes, what exactly is Africa's problem? We're living at this very special time. Here we are in 2010. We've just seen over the past 30 years countries like China and India, Brazil and Russia, but also closer to home, places like South Africa and Botswana, move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China alone moving 300 million people out of poverty. The thing that we must remember is that these countries have accomplished this not by relying on aid, certainly not to the extent that African countries rely on it today. You might be sitting here and say to yourselves, well, what exactly is the problem with aid? And I just want to clarify what I mean exactly by aid. I am not talking about emergency or humanitarian aid, which is the type of aid we would send in the case of Haiti or what has tragically happened in Pakistan recently. I believe that there's a moral imperative for us as human beings and the fact that we're interconnected, that we should act when those type of calamities occur. So I'm not talking about that type of aid. Nor am I talking about NGO or charitable aid. I myself am involved in that type of aid. I sit on a number of charity boards. However, given what I said about the 7% growth rate that we need to achieve on a long-term sustained basis, we have to also be humble and accept the reality that sending $20 to a child to go to school or to build a well in Africa is simply not going to create the jobs and to get the growth that we desperately need. The type of aid that I'm critiquing in my book is the billions of dollars that go to African governments every single year. It's now at least $50 billion, probably closer to $100 billion a year. In total, in the past 50 years, over $1 trillion of aid has gone to Africa. And yet, to quote Paul Collier, who was my PhD supervisor, who wrote a fantastic book called The Bottom Billion, Africa is shearing off from the rest of the world. What do we know to be true? We know that countries that have achieved long-term economic growth and sustainably put a dent in poverty have not relied on aid. So this begs the question, why are we continuing to pursue a policy in Africa that we know has no evidence anywhere on earth of working? Here I'd like to quote George W. Bush, and I have to say I'm stunned that I ever would quote him, but I think this is the one thing that he said that was absolutely brilliant, which was, and he actually was not referring to Africa, but it absolutely applies, and it was, we all must be careful of the soft bigotry of low expectations. And as far as I'm concerned, to see a population of 1 billion people continue to eke out a pretty sad living on a daily basis, when we know exactly what generates economic growth, things like trade, foreign direct investment, the capital markets, remittances and savings, things that actually create accountability for the average African to be able to hold their governments accountable. we then must ask ourselves, why are we continuing to pursue a policy that has no evidence of generating economic growth and reducing poverty across this continent? There's a lot of work that needs to be done, for sure. And I think, given the fact that we are living in a time where countries like the United States are facing 10% unemployment rates, places like the United Kingdom next week on Tuesday, the 20th of October, they'll be announcing severe cuts that could see as many as 1 million people in Britain out of work. Those types of things should be a moment for us to pause and ask ourselves, does it make sense for Africans to sit back and wait for aid to come from these countries that themselves so desperately need to sort out their own financial issues? You might be asking yourself, as I alluded to earlier, why exactly is aid problematic? And I want here for you to think a little bit about the way that you live here in the United States. You as individuals have implicitly accepted to be taxed by your government, and in return, your government provides you with public goods: education, healthcare, infrastructure, national security. When the government does not provide you with that set of what economists call public goods, you are allowed and able to vote them out of office at intervals. In a democratic process, as you know, in a few weeks here in the US, you're allowed to go, you vote, and you vote in incompetent government out of office. Let's think for a moment now what happens in a context of particularly what happens in Africa, where somebody else, in this case the international community, provides aid money to African governments and thereby allows African governments to abdicate their responsibilities of providing that set of public goods: education, healthcare, infrastructure, and national security. Those goods are currently being provided to the African people by the international community. So where, we should ask ourselves, are the African governments? And more importantly, how, now that aid severs this link between the taxpayer and the government, how do you expect Africans to hold their governments accountable? These are fundamental questions. They're questions about justice. It's completely unacceptable that at a time when the world has seen income inequalities shifting and reducing between the developing world and developed world, at a time when we've seen hundreds of millions of people actually move out of poverty, to see that Africa, again to Pope Paul Collier, is shearing off and moving in the wrong direction. We must keep African governments sweet. We have to keep them accountable. It is absolutely unacceptable to have the face of African policy making be the face of celebrities who attend the White House, they go to the G7, G20 meetings and talk on behalf of African people. That is not what we've subscribed to. 1 billion people, 60% under the age of 24. We have got to change, and the time for change is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damodisa, very much. Amartya Sen was born in India. He studied at Presidency College in India and at Trinity College, Cambridge. He is a professor at Harvard and a fellow at Trinity College, where he was the master of Trinity College from 1998 to 2004. He is, as all of you no doubt know, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998 for his pioneering work in welfare economics. He is a prolific author, having written many books, including Development as Freedom. His latest book, which he will be discussing today, The Idea of Justice, sets out very directly to address the work of his longtime colleague and friend John Rawls, and do something quite different from what Professor Rawls did. The intellectual tour de force that John Rawls created was a conception of justice designed from the original position by people who had organized the principles of society, not knowing what their attributes are while they're in that original position, not knowing if they're going to be rich or poor, not knowing their sex, not knowing anything about who they are. They would get together and organize a just society. Professor Sen in the idea of justice, tries to do something very, very different. Not create the ideal society that is a wonderful theory but won't exist, but rather create, from principles of justice, action steps that can pragmatically alleviate injustice. And he will now tell us how he approaches that in The Idea of Justice. Professor Martison.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here at the Boston Book Fair and very grateful for the invitation and very grateful to you all for coming for this session, even if you've come primarily to hear my two colleagues and three colleagues. I'm delighted to be in such great company here. Having expressed my gratefulness to the fair, I have a minor complaint to make, namely the way my book is described. I saw when I looked at the description that I have discussed how to achieve social justice in a world where cultures have widely different beliefs. Unfortunately, that's not quite right. I don't believe cultures have widely different beliefs. I think
I didn't read that.
No, I'm delighted too. and there are big differences within cultures, and the engagement is more like what Joel said with the book. So it was a little nostalgic for me to think of the time when I was teaching in Oxford. We used to know of a professor at Oxford who was stopped for driving on the wrong side of the road, which in Oxford is the right side. And when he was stopped by the policeman, he told the policeman, "But officer, here in Geneva, we always drive on the left." And the officer was extremely confused, didn't know where to begin, whether to point out that he was not driving on the left, he was driving on the right, that in Geneva they don't drive on the left, they do drive on the right, and that this was Broad Street, Oxford, and not Geneva. So he said that I will have to think about it, the policeman said. So I think the description has made me very thoughtful too, as to exactly where to emphasize. But before the content of the book, which Joel was doing, I want to mention that the culturally separatist way of thinking about justice is, I think, very seriously mistaken. This is because it may be very, very tempting to think of religious extremism today coming from terrorists, maybe, to be a part of the Middle Eastern or Eastern, non-Western approach. But that would be like saying Nazism is a quintessentially European approach, or thinking that the Inquisitions indicate what to expect of Europe. I might mention that when the Indian Emperor Akbar was arranging multi-religious dialogues in Agra, the 1590s and 1600s, it's exactly the time when Giordano Bruno was being burnt at the stake in Rome for heresy. I think the world is very much more complicated. The differences are not so much between cultures, but within cultures. We know that today in the political election going on, the differences between the approaches of the Tea Party on one side and the others who would like to think of the state having a major role in the well-being of people on the other is absolutely enormous. And this is not a cultural difference. It's a political difference within culture. Now, the starting point of my book, in some ways, is a division of thought in Europe, but it has parallels elsewhere, in the European Enlightenment, in the 18th century primarily, where there are two approaches to justice. One is the social contract approach. You think of how you would proceed to build a perfectly just world, in particular just institutions within a sovereign national state. Now that's the kind of approach first promoted by Hobbes in 17th century, pursued by Locke, Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and continued today to John Rawls, and what Joel described is in some way the most sophisticated version of the social contract approach that we get from the finest of our political philosophers of our time, namely John Rawls. There's a different approach, which is also in the 18th century Europe, and that is the approach of what we might broadly call social choice. It's concerned with identifying removable injustices like slavery, like subjugation of women, and you think of people like the Marquis de Condorcet in France, or Adam Smith in Britain, or Mary Wollstonecraft, probably the most underestimated thinker of all time, discussing that approach being much the most important way of thinking about justice, about how to identify injustice on the basis of public reasoning an agreement could be found. You may not find agreement on everything. When slavery was being abolished, people who were fighting for it, which included Smith and Condorcet and Wollstonecraft, among others, when they were fighting for it, they were under no illusion that the removal of slavery would make the world perfectly just. The engagement was different. What are the identifiable injustices on which there could be a reasoned agreement, not agreement based on self-interest, and that's where the Rawlsian experiment, which Joel described very, very nicely, is relevant. My book does draw on Rawls, but tries to go beyond it. Indeed, my book is dedicated to John Rawls. This approach is the one which I try to pursue, which is concerned with identifying injustices, it's concerned with comparative justice, it's not concerned with a complete, total ordering of every state in the world in terms of justice so that you can pick up the best point. I think we will continue to have different views about what a perfectly just world would look like, but we could nevertheless agree on all kinds of things. We could agree on the fact today that just as the 18th century thinkers, many of them were agreed on slavery, on tyranny, and subjugation of women, and so on. Subjugation of women, alas, has continued to today's world in a different form. But that, along with people dying of illnesses for which cure are known and medicines can be produced cheaply but are not produced, a world in which hundreds of millions of children do not go to school because there are no schools, a world in which tyranny and torture takes place on a regular basis, sometimes carried out by the leaders of the global establishment. The issues of justice here is to present argument about what are the identifiable injustices on which we could have agreement right now and right here. Now, it's not, I was very pleased when Joel described me as a practical thinker, and I guess I would like to think of myself, but the book is mainly a theory book. But I'm afraid I'm one of those who believe that you do need a theory in order to decide what the practice should be. So it's really concerned with fact. I have had more practical books than the present one, I have to say. But it stands behind the practice as to how to think about the theory of practice, how to do research for action. That's really what it is concerned with. Now, again, to come back to the theme with which I began, mainly as a dialectical device in contrast with the description of the book that I read, the exactly similar contrast between these two things in the 18th century you find in other regions too. One of them, which I discuss a lot, is a contrast in beginning from about 3rd century BC in Indian legal and philosophical thinking between two concepts of justice. Sanskrit has about 20 terms for justice, but one of them is, to take two of them, niti is perfect organization, being exactly right, and it's about institutions, it's about arrangements, it's about patterns. Nyaya is concerned with what happens in the world. It's concerned with how people's lives go, their well-being, their capabilities, and so on. One of the things the Nyaya theorists discuss is they think that at all costs what we have to avoid is what they call Matsanaya. Matza is fish, Matsanaya is justice in the world of fish, where it is argued that it's thought that the justice in the world of fish is that the big fish can eat small fish at will. Doesn't matter, they're free to do that. Now the argument is no matter how good the institutions are, if the big fish remain free to eat up the small fish, if that's what's happening to the people, then it is denial of justice in the sense of Nyaya. Now that's a contrast. If you come back to European thought, and since all these are interlinked, take Ferdinand I, the Holy Roman Emperor, when he said, let justice be done, even if the world perish. That is a principle of justice seen as niti, because what it's saying that that there's a definable justice, we would pursue it even if the world is totally disappears. Now, if the world totally disappears in the sense of Nyaya, it would be hard to say it's a just world. There is nothing left to be just about. So I think what you have to see there is Ferdinand I is a very good example, a very strong, articulate example of an extreme niti, and Nyaya is a contrast with that. How are the freedoms and the well-being of people going? How can we think about these arrangements? That's really what the book is about. The theory is about that, the connection with such issues as democracy, with human rights, with public agitation, public discussion, and global public discussion is about that. Since you are not looking for a perfectly just world, you're not bothered by the fact that you may not have a sovereign state for the world as a whole. The theory of justice is not parasitic on a sovereign state. It's concerned with public reasoning, agreement in public reasoning, and that can take place across the world very widely indeed. And as the issues of poverty, including some of the ones that Dambisa discussed, the issues of tyranny, continued torture, the issues of people not having basic education, not having basic health care, all these come into the story in a big way, in a global context. And the fact that we cannot have a global state right now and right here doesn't prevent us from agreeing that these are issues of injustice on which we can concentrate. And it's not something that is just a practical way out against theory. The theory itself is demanding that. That is the theory of Nyaya. That is the theory that one gets from Adam Smith and Condorcet and David Hume and Wilson Craft and Tom Paine and many others later, John Stuart Mill and so on. We can pursue that approach, and my book is an attempt to do just that and to present how to think about these hard issues in a way that doesn't compromise with ideas, theories, principles, and the rigor of reasoning, which is absolutely central to the idea of justice, I believe. Thank you very much.
Let me say, Professor Sen, in addition to thanks, that I did not mean to undermine your book as a theory. It's simply that since I was able to read it, I thought it was a very approachable. Our next presenter is Michael Sandel, who's a professor at Harvard. He was educated at Brandeis University. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and he received his doctorate from Oxford. He is a very popular political philosophy professor at Harvard. His most recent book is Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, which is has been a New York Times bestseller. And it relates the key questions of political philosophy to the most vexing issues of our time in very specific, practical ways. Professor Sandel.
Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. I have two things to say about the way we talk about justice these days in this country. The first, it might not be very controversial. We're not very good at talking about justice in our public life. What passes for public discourse these days consists mainly of shouting matches on talk radio and cable television, and ideological food fights on the floor of Congress. Why is this? And how might it be otherwise? This brings me to the second thing I have to say about the way we talk about justice. And this may get me into more trouble than my first observation. I think the reason that our public discourse is so impoverished is that we've developed a bad habit. And that bad habit is to shy away, to shrink from engaging in public discourse with some of the biggest, deepest moral and even spiritual questions that citizens in democratic societies care about. The reason, I think, we've shrunk from engaging with hard moral questions in politics is understandable. We live in a diverse society. People disagree about questions of morality and religion. So there is a powerful temptation to say, let's not get into those questions publicly. Let's relegate moral convictions and arguments to private life or to the internal lives of religious communities. And let's try to talk about justice and rights without reference to competing conceptions of the best way to live, without reference to the substantive moral and spiritual convictions that we disagree about. That's an understandable reflex in a pluralist society, but I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake that has led our public discourse to become hollowed out. And I think it's a mistake that has been especially damaging to those who think of themselves on the progressive side of the political spectrum. Very often we think, well, those on the right are the ones who bring moral and religious questions into politics. That's the Christian coalition. That's the moral majority. Those are Islamic fundamentalists. And their mistake, we sometimes say, is to bring these fraught, contested, private moral views into politics. We don't want to do that. That's a recipe for disagreement at best and for intolerance and coercion at worst. I think that impulse, which is very purposely and argue with the conception of the fetus that's advanced by those who say personhood begins at conception and therefore abortion should be banned. Because if they are right about the fetus, then abortion should be banned. So we can't avoid that question. If the opponents of embryonic stem cell research are right, that from the moment that you have even a blastocyst, you have a person, if they're right about that, then despite all the medical promise, embryonic stem cell research should be banned. Why? Because we wouldn't say that if we had what clearly is a person, let's say a 5-year-old child, it would be morally permissible to yank out that child's organs in order to achieve great life-saving medical research. We wouldn't say that. So those who would defend embryonic stem cell research must have a view about the moral status of the early embryo. Likewise, in the case of same-sex marriage, there's a temptation to say, let's keep people's moral judgment out of it. But look at the Massachusetts Supreme Court opinion by Chief Justice Marshall, which established a right to same-sex marriage in Massachusetts. Her opinion was striking precisely because it didn't rest simply on the idea that it's a matter of freedom of choice and non-discrimination, and that's all there is to be said. She took on directly, if you look at the opinion, the claim of the defenders of traditional marriage. She took on the claim that the purpose of marriage as a social institution is procreation. She said that's not true. Because when couples marry in traditional marriage, we don't ask them if they're going to procreate, and we don't require them to. People beyond the age of reproduction, those without having to argue publicly about these fraught questions. I think a better response for progressives is not to flee moral argument in politics, but to engage with it, which means that those of us who would oppose banning abortion have to take seriously and argue with the conception of the fetus that's advanced by those who say personhood begins at conception and therefore abortion should be banned. Because if they are right about the fetus, then abortion should be banned. So we can't avoid that question. If the opponents of embryonic stem cell research are right, that from the moment that you have even a blastocyst, you have a person, if they're right about that, then despite all the medical promise, embryonic stem cell research should be banned. Why? Because we wouldn't say that if we had what clearly is a person, let's say a 5-year-old child, it would be morally permissible to yank out that child's organs in order to achieve great life-saving medical research. We wouldn't say that. So those who would defend embryonic stem cell research must have a view about the moral status of the early embryo. Likewise, in the case of same-sex marriage, there's a temptation to say, let's keep people's moral judgment out of it. But look at the Massachusetts Supreme Court opinion by Chief Justice Marshall, which established a right to same-sex marriage in Massachusetts. Her opinion was striking precisely because it didn't rest simply on the idea that it's a matter of freedom of choice and non-discrimination, and that's all there is to be said. She took on directly, if you look at the opinion, the claim of the defenders of traditional marriage. She took on the claim that the purpose of marriage as a social institution is procreation. She said that's not true. Because when couples marry in traditional marriage, we don't ask them if they're going to procreate, and we don't require them to. People beyond the age of reproduction may marry. So she said it can't be true that marriage as a social institution in our society, as we practice it, is only or mainly about procreation. It also has another moral purpose, which is to honor and recognize and affirm and encourage a mutual, lifelong, loving commitment between two persons. And if that's the purpose of marriage, then same-sex couples qualify. And she took on the view that gay and lesbian relations are inferior. She said that view is wrong. She didn't say we should bracket that and set it aside. So in each of these cases, philosophically, it seems, it's not really possible to set aside the underlying moral question in talking about matters of justice and rights, but it's also politically debilitating because it cedes to conservative and often the narrowest, most intolerant voices a monopoly on the most resonant sources of political discourse, which very often are moral and spiritual. How did this happen? In 1960, this wasn't the cause, but a sign of the times, a gesture in this direction. In 1960, you remember John F. Kennedy was seeking the presidency, and he confronted what was called the religious question. It was a polite name for religious intolerance. He was a Catholic. And he went to Houston, Texas, and he spoke to ministers, a convention of Protestant ministers, to try to put to rest the religious question. And It was a great success, but his argument was, I'm not the Catholic candidate for president, I'm the Democratic candidate, and when I become president, if I become president, my religious convictions will be, as they are, for me, purely private, and will have no bearing on the conduct of my presidency. Now, that was a great success politically, and it's clear why he was driven to say that. Compare that view about the role of religion in moral and political discourse to the view articulated in 2006, just before he declared his candidacy, by Barack Obama. Obama made the opposite argument. He said when he was running for the Senate in Illinois, and he was told Jesus Christ would not vote for Barack Obama because of his views on abortion and same-sex marriage. He said back then he gave the liberal answer. He said, I'm running for the Senate, for senator from Illinois, not minister of Illinois. And he said that argument was good enough at the time, but he said that there was something inadequate about that argument. And he made the case very powerfully that moral and religious discourse belongs in politics because it bears on the questions of justice and rights that we debate every day. Secularists, this is what Obama said, secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering the public square. And then he gave some examples from U.S. history: Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King. Indeed, the majority of great reformers in American history have not only been motivated by faith, but repeatedly used religious language to argue for their cause. So to say that men and women should not inject their quote-unquote personal morality into public policy debates is an absurdity. Barack Obama in 2006, the opposite view from the one articulated by John F. Kennedy in 1960. On this question, and it is ultimately a question not only of politics but also of political philosophy, I think Obama was right and Kennedy was wrong. Now it's, I think, been a difficulty and a challenge of the Obama presidency so far that he has not succeeded in translating the moral and civic energy of his campaign into his presidency. During the health care debate, one of the reasons I think it spun out of control is that he fell into discussing health care in technocratic terms. He said, you remember over that long summer, we have to bend the cost curve in the out years, and that's why we have to do health care reform. He lost, for a time, he lost contact with health care as a fundamentally moral question. And he recovered toward the fall. He recovered the moral way of speaking about health care as having to do with the fundamental responsibilities we owe one another as citizens, sharing a common life of a certain character. So it seems to me that we're not very good at talking about justice these days. That's why our political discourse is empty, hollowed out, and impoverished. That the only way to lift up the terms of political discourse is to engage more directly with the big moral and sometimes spiritual questions that lie just beneath the surface of the arguments we have every day. Whether those arguments are on the hot-button cultural issues I offered as examples, or health care, or bailouts, or tax policy, or immigration, or the responsibilities we have to alleviate poverty half a world away. I don't say that a politics of moral engagement will lead to agreement. We do disagree on big moral questions. But what I'm suggesting is that it will elevate our public discourse, improve the civic education that democracy at its best performs, and will enrich what it means to be a democratic citizen. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, I would much prefer that the Q&A session consist of questions from all of you. So we will throw it open to the audience, and as you're figuring out how you want to, what to ask, it's not quite clear to me how you're going to ask it, but we're going to let you stand up. I'll try to spot you, and you'll try to speak loudly enough. And if there's a gap to fill in, I'll fill it in, but I can already tell there's likely not going to be. Sir.
This question is addressed to all three speakers. So often when we talk about justice, particularly social justice, we're talking about economic issues. When we talk about economic issues, so often the questions arise as to what the sacrifice might be for those who try to aid others who are in need. And I am very, very curious as to the way our three thoughtful guests approach that question. Is my question clear? Let me give an example. If, let's say, someone is going to give charity and has a certain income, and in giving charity, perhaps one's own standard of living might be adversely affected. At what point, say, does one decide I am or am not going to help those who are less fortunate than I am? And on the large question of real suffering, as was described, for example, in Africa, how do we go about it? How do the speakers think about that issue? How do they approach that issue? What do they take into account in making those decisions?
So let me suggest you might take the second one first. Professor Sen, you talk about identifiable injustices, and Professor Sandel, you talk about the need to address them quite directly. And I think part of what the questioner is getting at is it required that we achieve some shared consensus as to what those identifiable injustices actually are? And if it is necessary to do that, how do we achieve that consensus?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. One has to distinguish between two different issues. There is the issue of personal morality. How much should I, as an individual, give, independently of what others are doing? Secondly, what kind of an agreement I would feel it would be just for me to agree, provided I could persuade sufficiently others to make it to be a rule that we give a certain proportion of our income for a certain purpose, like giving taxes, paying taxes for national defense, or security, or pension, or for that matter, health care, if that were to be needed. So I think those two questions have to be separated. On the first question, I don't really, as the part of the theory of justice, nothing very much additional to offer than what has been discussed standardly across the world. On the second question, there's a great deal to think about, namely what kind of an agreement would reduce injustice of, say, people dying without food, or people dying without proper medical care, or people doing their childhood without schooling. How much are you ready to give for that purpose? Now, I think my claim is that if we intelligently and reasonably argued about that, there could be much wider agreement on these issues, even though that would not be an agreement on the vision of a perfectly just world. Now, the lines vary. I mean, for example, when India became independent, India continued to have famines until right after the independence. The last famine was 1943. India became independent in 1947. After that, there had been no famine because a government is regarded as culpable, and famines are easy to prevent, as I tried to argue in a different kind of work in economics. And the government has to have the incentive. And democracy provided that incentive, even though only 5 or 10% of the people are actually affected by famine. That's not a majority in a democratic vote. Just that moral commitment that we must do whatever is needed to prevent famine became quite ingrained, and exactly in the kind of line you're discussing, accepting not seen individually, but socially as to what we should all do together. That became the form of the argument. And that was, I thought, a satisfactory progress. On the other hand, the continuation of non-extreme undernourishment in India, where there have not been an adequate combination of democratic forces to agree to eliminate it, I think is a failure of democratic practice and requires greater engagement. Just the kind of question that you're asking, being placed not at the individual level, but at the social level. And my hope is that more vigorous public discussion, the media has a role to play here, and open public discussion like the one we're having today here, all these have a role to play in making the world a more just place, a less unjust place. With addressing issues of this kind, of which you gave one example, there would be other issues dealing with tyranny, liberty, and so on. So in all these respects, I think what we are looking for is not how to agree on a perfectly just world, but how to agree on what can be done here and now. The only thing I'd add to your line of question, socially, including things where we do it together, is not just I give alone and others give nothing. It's just that we all agree to give a certain proportion. That's the nature of state action, and the public reasoning could promote a view of removing injustice which proceeds along that line.
Michael?
I agree with that. Maybe we should.
Yeah, Vista? Sure.
I actually agree as well. I don't want to take too much time sort of recapping what Professor Sen has just said. However, I will say, and picking up on what Professor Sandel was talking about earlier, we are caught in a trap of political imperatives. And so in the context of Africa specifically, I really believe that we have enough logic and evidence to solve the problem of poverty. We can put a man on the moon, we can solve the problem of poverty in Africa. I really do believe, however, that a lot of vested interests, a lot of sort of unsavory motivations have led us to what I would consider low-level equilibrium, so that we set aside the evidence of things like the Marshall Plan that clearly had benefits. There's $100 billion in today's terms that was sent from the United States to Europe. It clearly helped. It was short, sharp, and finite. We can learn from these type of interventions in the Green Revolution and some of the things that have happened around the world. But there's an imperative where that incentivizes governments, not just in Africa, but around the world, to continue a system that doesn't work because of the political arguments that if they do this, they win votes. And it's that type of thing that I believe necessitates the sort of discourse and discussions that Professor Sandel was talking about. We've got to be honest. We cannot sit on Earth for 60 years and see people, 1 billion people, worse off than they were 40 years ago. Life expectancy on the decline. Poor education, poor health care, no infrastructure, poverty levels increasing, and continue to do the same thing. Businesses that would do that would be out of business. Political systems in the United States would never be able to survive 60 years with the record that continues in Africa. An analogy which I found really shocking is the public education system in this country. As a foreigner, I can say I'm stunned at what's going on here. Reading some of the statistics and what has happened with Michelle Rhee in Washington, D.C., I mean, it's pretty scary reading. How can we all agree on what the problems are, but not get around the table to discuss what the solutions are? And I think it really, really is important for us to have this type of discussion. As I said earlier on, we're all on the same side. It's not just about poverty in Africa. It is about healthcare issues. It is about issues around education. And it's a matter of giving everybody the space to articulate the views, because we do have the ability to transform the world and to create justice.
Thank you, Dambisa. That was great. I just got the signal, believe it or not, that we're out of time, which shocks me because it feels like we're just getting started. I do want you to know that our authors will all be outside in the Google Pavilion. Their books are available for sale by Brookline Booksmith. They'll be there to sign them for you and to answer some questions. And thank you all very much for attending today.